Topic of this PowerPoint is World War II. When we look at World War II, obviously we're not looking at the fighting that happened during World War II, but rather the impact that World War II had on Colorado. As you can see, the biggest impact was economic for Colorado. We got a lot of war contracts because of our location, and the aftermath of the war also proved very profitable for Colorado. That's when we saw a lot of industry come in, a lot of technology come in, and it was the post-war boom and what we might categorize as urban sprawl. Just to give you an outline of what we're going to cover in this PowerPoint, we're going to cover first war contracts that Colorado garnered as a result of World War II, then look at the war camps that were present within Colorado. You also have a film to watch this week on Amachi, which is one of the war camps that we had during World War II. We're going to then focus on post-war boom and finally look briefly at urban sprawl. Our first topic is war contracts. During World War II, a lot of political leaders secured war contracts. They knew that it was going to be really profitable to garner those contracts, and you can see about $360 million came into the state's economy because of those war contracts. Here's a couple examples of the sort of war contracts that Colorado got. We were able to assemble parts for destroyers and artillery shells. We also got the Lowry Air Force Base and the Fitzsimmons Army Hospital. During World War II, there was also a mining boom. We had a lot of lead and zinc that was discovered, and this was really profitable because that is some of the things that they needed to make different ammunition and artillery. However, we also discovered things like uranium, and that was used for the Manhattan Project, which created the first atomic bomb. Next, we're moving on to war camps. War camps were another thing that happened during World War II. Colorado got some war contracts to basically house people during the war who were people of suspicion or people the federal government wanted watched. So these prisoner of war camps or internment camps were in Colorado. We had different internment camps and prisoner of war camps. I list just a few of them here, and it's certainly an interesting topic, so if you're interested in this topic, I would encourage you to look more into it. However, here's just a brief list of where some of the camps were or the names of the camps. Camp Carson, there was also a camp in Greeley, Trinidad, and Camp Hale, which was up in the mountains. And those camps housed upwards of about 20,000 Italian and German prisoners of war. We also had an internment camp, Camp Amachi, which is near present-day Grenada in Colorado. You can look that up on the Colorado map. And that housed about 7,000 Japanese Americans during the war. If you don't know, what happened during World War II is that the federal government felt it was necessary to relocate Japanese Americans. They relocated them from places along the ocean where they felt like they might pose a threat to places inland all throughout the United States. And Colorado was one of the places that they housed Japanese Americans. I encourage you, and it's one of the requirements of this week, to watch the film. It is a little different story than you may have heard before, so please watch that and get a sense of how internment camps looked in Colorado and how they differed from other places. Let's now turn to the post-war boom. Post-war boom happened for many reasons. We had a lot of new industries come in. One of the first industries we're going to talk about is the Rocky Mountain Arsenal. The Rocky Mountain Arsenal is located here in Colorado. just outside of Golden, Colorado, and is currently a wildlife refuge as well as a place to go fishing and enjoy the outdoors. However, back in 1942, the Army basically, or they did own that land. And when they owned the land, what they did is they, between 1942 and 1950, built and provided materials for chemical warfare, including things like mustard gas. So the Army was doing this for about an 8-year span of time. They owned the land basically until 1982, and they leased off portions of that land between 1947 and 1982 to the Shell Oil Company. The Shell Oil Company, when the Army owned the land, was manufacturing herbicides and pesticides, basically toxic chemicals. The Army continued to work on the land alongside Shell Oil Company. Between 1953 and 1957, the Army manufactured a nerve agent. As we know, this is the time of Cold War, and there was a lot of chemical weapons being manufactured during this time. Well, this was happening right in our backyard here at the Rocky Mountain Arsenal. A lot of things were occurring for about 40 years on this land. You can see that the Army continued their chemical warfare between 1957 and 1969. They filled chemical munitions, which is basically the chemical components for different things that they might drop on their opponents. Between about 1970 and 1982, the Army finally started to dispose and try to destroy the chemicals that they were working with. However, what we'll find is they didn't do so great a job. Today we know that the impact that the Army and the Shell Oil Company had on the people around the Rocky Mountain Arsenal is pretty significant. There's really only proof, or proof that is quantifiable, that some of the people surrounding as well as working within the Rocky Mountain Arsenal died of cancer, lung cancer and bladder cancer. There was also a number of lawsuits, however, where there were things such as learning disabilities, asthma, other things associated with the impact that the Rocky Mountain Arsenal had on people. Now, why did the Rocky Mountain Arsenal have such an impact on people? Well, as we can see, it was because of the impact that they had on the land. Millions of gallons during that 40-year span of time that they were there on the land were discharged into the land. A lot of the munitions that they were using, the chemical munitions, were buried in unlined holes. Hundreds of waterfowl died during that time. We see unexplained sickness in cows. Crops died or were severely mutated. We also see a contamination in groundwater, buildings, surface soil, deeper soils, and the sediments. The EPA came in to the Rocky Mountain Arsenal and declared it a Superfund site. Some people say it is the worst Superfund site in the United States, and one number I have for cleanup so far is $409.2 million have been spent to try to clean up the chemicals that were produced during this time period. So we look at the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, and we're going to continue to look at the post-war boom. But the Rocky Mountain Arsenal is just one example, perhaps a more complex example that I wanted to provide you with, because I think it's important to know about the choices that were made in our post-war boom. We thought that the Army, as well as the Shell Company, was a great idea in our post-war era. However, as we can see, there were some consequences associated with having them in Colorado and the impact that they had on the people as well as the land. Other industries that came in during the post-war boom are things like IBM, HP or Hewlett-Packard, Kodak. We also invited a lot of footloose industries into Colorado. Footloose industries basically means that they don't need any sort of port in order to export or import goods. And one example of such a footloose industry is the Martin Marietta Aerospace Corporation. A number of research divisions also came into Colorado during this time. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is presently located in Boulder, is one example of such research divisions that came into Colorado. So while there are certainly some bad things that happened during this area, there's also some good things. But what sort of impact did this post-war boom have ultimately on Colorado? Well, what we see happen during this time is a lot of urban sprawl. As those companies are starting to develop, they are starting to develop all along the Front Range. People are all of a sudden having to start to drive to their jobs. And so in the 1950s, along with these industries coming in, we see the beginning of different interstates, highways, and the beginning of what we now coin as urban sprawl. So once again, we have to consider, while it is certainly a great thing to have economic development, what does it mean to live in a world in which urban sprawl is now basically part of our lives? And think back also to the time in which it started. So this week, what we're going to do is we're going to look at urban sprawl as a bigger issue. I want you to ponder urban sprawl, and I'm providing you with a link to look at one example. It's an example in Virginia, but it basically matches examples throughout the United States as well as what's happening in Colorado. What is the impact of urban sprawl on our communities, on our societies? So that's a look at World War II. Once again, we looked at what happened during World War II in terms of the sort of economic development that it provided Colorado. We looked at what happened in the post-war boom when we welcomed in things like the Rocky Mountain Arsenal as well as high-tech industries and research institutions. And finally, we closed with a look at what happened ultimately after the post-war boom and during the post-war boom as a result of that economic development. And we looked at urban sprawl there.